All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very honored and privileged to introduce our next instructor, Dr. Mary Grabar, not Grabar. I've been mispronouncing it since I first communicated with you. But a little background on how we got together. I was doing a little research on this incredible man, George Schuyler, about 5 years ago. And I had this painting, and at the time, I wanted to donate it to somebody or an organization that would post it somewhere. A lot of people would see it. It was hanging in my home, and, well, we have people come to my home, not as many as maybe some library or some institution that would revere him. And so I found an article written by Mary, Dr. Mary, on Schuyler, and it was written in 2010, and there was an email address, and I thought, I wonder if this is still a good address, and it was, and we communicated, and we had an admiration for the late George Schuyler. This painting now is at the Lane Learning Center in Lexington, Massachusetts, where it's prominently displayed, and some people still think it's Reverend Stevie Kraft. Although he's also a distinguished man, maybe we'll get somebody to do your portrait sometime soon. So I'm going to just read the biographical sketch. Also, I want to make sure that everybody is aware of this very important book, Debunking Howard Zinn. As I said a little while ago, Howard Zinn is the patron demon of Antifa and Black Lives Matter. His influence is why we see young people and some middle-aged people hating America, hating themselves, if you happen to be Caucasian. That's how brainwashed some folks are, and burning our cities down and burning our flag. There's a reason why they're doing that. And yes, some of them are being paid, but there's a reason why they're motivated. So I'm just going to read a quick little bio, which, by the way, is in our camp newspaper, yesterday's, the first day's edition. Mary Grabar was born in Slovenia when it was still part of the communist Yugoslavia, and grew up in Rochester, New York. I don't know which is more communist now, Rochester or Slovenia. She earned her Ph.D. in English from the University of Georgia in 2002 and taught at a number of colleges and universities in Georgia until 2013. While teaching, she wrote widely on political, cultural, and educational topics and founded the Dissident Professor Educational Project, a nonprofit reform initiative. In 2014, she moved to Clinton, New York, and became a resident fellow at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization. And so let's give her a nice warm hand.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. Well, I have been trying for 10 years to write this biography of George Schuyler. And before I did that, I wrote the book on Howard Zinn. And I always call it my dirty job. I don't know if any of you look like you're too young to remember the Mike Rowe show, Dirty Jobs. I don't know if it's on. All right, my son, who's now going to be 35, he loved that show because Mike Rowe would get into septic tanks and, do all this dirty work. He'd come out, with splattered with you didn't want to know what it was, and I felt like I was Mike Rowe by going through all of Howard Zinn's lies. So it was a dirty job. I had to clean it up and expose all his lies. And I wanted to write the George Schuyler biography because I've been researching it since 2011. I wrote my article in 2012, and I couldn't get it sold. One of the reasons, I think, is that he was a member of the John Birch Society. He was ostracized. So my agent told me to go ahead and write the Zinn book, and I had fun doing that. And then I went back to the Schuyler book, and he said, no, you need to get another book out before they'll accept before we can have some hope of getting the Schuyler book published. So I proposed debunking the 1619 Project. And that will be out on September 7th, and it's also with Regnery. And so anyway, I'm back to working on the Schuyler book, which is a labor of love, unlike the dirty jobs here. So what is the 1619 Project? Some of you may have heard on the news recently about the creator, Nicole Hannah-Jones's comments that were uncovered from last year, in which she said that true racial equality was seen in Cuba. Perfect time to bring those out, right, as people are protesting in the streets with American flags. Well, that's Nicole Hannah-Jones. She created this. And what it was intended to do was to mark the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first Africans on these shores in Jamestown in 1619. She presented it as something new that nobody knew about. Of course, that's completely wrong. If you read the historians, especially the African-American historians, you'll see that they knew all about it. They were writing it, they were celebrating it. But anyway, what it was literally looked like this. It was a 100-page magazine, New York Times issue of August 18th, 2019, and they also had about a 15-page newspaper insert. What it consists of, these 100-some pages, are 10 long essays dealing with historical subjects. There are 17 works of creative writing, poetry, I don't know what you call it, they're very bizarre, sort of prose pieces, and a number of short articles, personal stories, and a lot of photographs. So that's to commemorate the 1619 anniversary. Another anniversary that I think would have been appropriate to commemorate in 2019 would be the establishment of the Communist Party in the United States in New York City. So in 1919, that's when the Communist Party first established its beachhead in the United States. And they have been working ever since to start a race war. Yeah. And George Schuyler knew it. He saw it firsthand. In 1919, he wasn't writing for publication yet. He had just been out of the Army. He was about to be published in a few years. But he saw that. He witnessed it firsthand. He knew all the actors. But I don't want to go too far into my topic of this afternoon, which is George Schuyler, which is the topic I love to talk about. But the Communist Party has been trying, they saw the weak spot. As you heard in the presentation before, there wasn't something done in the Constitution that could have been done. There's a lot of complicated reasons for that. To end slavery, which was an abomination. But upon Lenin's orders, that's the weak point that they targeted. So anyway, there were commemorations of 1619, and I see the 1619 Project as part of that effort. It's a long-going effort. The Soviet Union has been brought down, but we've got the Marxists in this country who are continuing that project, and this is the latest iteration. Unfortunately, this will be published as a book, and this project here is being used in schools. It was immediately sent to 3,500 schools, and it's now in 4,500 schools plus. And you can be sure that by the time the book form, the expanded book form, comes out in November, it's going to be used even more widely. I did not get a physical copy of this. I looked at the price. It's $410 for this magazine on Amazon. That's how popular it is, unfortunately. Okay, so what I want to do is sort of go through the points that are made by Hannah Jones's lead essay. She is the creator of this. As the editor says, it was from her mind that this idea sprang. So she wrote the lead essay, and so I'm going to focus on that, the points that she makes, and then there's one other essay that deals with economic issues. So the introduction leading up to her essay, the editor says that the year 1619 was far less familiar to Americans than 1776. And then he posed this question about our national birth date. What if we were to tell you that this fact, which is taught in our schools and unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, is wrong, and that the country's true birth date, the moment that its defining contradictions first came into the world, was in late August of 1619. Okay, the defining contradictions is a common Marxist phrase. The new date, which has come to be observed, as he writes, and he doesn't say by whom and when, but it's come to be observed, is August 20th. And on Hannah Jones's Twitter page, up until recently, she had 1619 crossed out she had 1776 crossed out with 1619 replacing it. The introduction further states that the arrival of the ship, the White Lion, bearing 20-some Africans to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, quote, inaugurated a barbaric system of chattel slavery that would last for the next 250 years. This is sometimes referred to as the country's original sin, but it is more than that. It is the country's very origin. Okay, so it's the original sin. I think that's a misuse of the idea of original sin, which is right, disobedience to God, and it's universal, not limited to one race. And then comes the slippery sentence in this introduction. The goal of the 1619 project is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's true founding. Okay, so is this simply a thought experiment? Are we supposed to just think about whether or not we should consider it? Are we supposed to do an academic exercise and maybe have a discussion about what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's true founding? Or is the project intended to overthrow July 4th, 1776? Yeah, you know it, right? And eventually eliminate Independence Day the same way that Columbus Day is being eliminated. I think we're seeing some evidence of that. I believe it is to eliminate the 4th of July. Just consider the 4th of July this year. Okay, last year we had the 1619 riots. Someone at the Claremont Institute called them that, and when Hannah Jones was asked about it, she said she was very proud that the riots had come about from this project. Okay, so last summer, after the death of George Floyd, we had $2 billion, over $2 billion worth of damages from rioting. Between May 24th and August 22nd, there were about 570 violent demonstrations in 220 locations across the country. It left at least 25 Americans, including police officers, white and black, dead. This year, Juneteenth, with little debate, was made a national holiday. June 19th was the day in 1865 when slaves in Texas received their belated announcement about emancipation. So consider that a New York Post editorial this year on July 5th titled "Liberals Media Turned July 4th into America Bash Fest," and that NBC commentator Matt Sullivan had decried the playing of the national anthem at NBA games, and that National Geographic claimed that communities of color are disproportionately exposed to air pollution from fireworks, and that a Washington Post, they're very creative. And that a Washington Post an architecture critic called the Statue of Liberty a symbol of hypocrisy. Black Lives Matter Utah called the American flag racist. R&B singer Macy Gray called for a new American flag because the white stripes no longer represent, quote, purity. And Missouri Congresswoman Cori Bush tweeted that Independence Day represented freedom only for white people because this land was, quote, stolen and black people still aren't free. Representative, I can go on, Maxine Waters condemned voter suppression laws and referred to the fact that on the original Independence Day, black people were enslaved. Okay, well, yes. Former MSNBC host Touré wrote an article for the Griot titled F Independence Day. That was the title. The only Independence Day he said he recognized was Juneteenth. National Public Radio changed its traditional reading of the Declaration of Independence to add commentary about the Declaration's purported flaws and deeply ingrained hypocrisies. They explained the reason for the change at their website. Quote, after last summer's protests and our national reckoning on race, the words land differently. Well, wait a minute, this was all supposed to be, a moment of healing, and we were supposed to get understanding, but it doesn't seem so. Okay, the New York Times published an article that claimed that the American flag no longer represented everyone, but mostly people on the political right. The article also quoted a survey that showed about 70% of Americans say that the flag makes them feel proud. However, sadly, broken down by race, 80% of white Americans felt this way, but only 60% of black Americans did. 66% of Republicans associated the flag with their party, but only 34% of Democrats did. Of course, that should not be surprising. I think a lot of it can be attributed to the 1619 Project. It's not that the project is the first time that American history has been revised and written as anti-American history. Leftists in academia have been dominating history telling for decades. But the 1619 Project took revisionism to a new level and brought it to people in a non-academic form. It has joined Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which has been in continuous publication since 1980 and has broken sales records. Like Howard Zinn's Marxist history, the 1619 Project is an effort to rewrite history through selective omission, misrepresentations of quoted material, reliance on dubious sources, and falsification. The rhetorical or writing strategies are similar. Both Howard Zinn and Nicole Hannah-Jones use emotional appeals that resonate, right? Especially with young people. It's written for young people, the disaffected, and the naive. Both exploit Americans' desires to be fair-minded. They both claim that American founding principles are to blame for atrocities throughout American history. They both present historical advancements as struggle, That's the word that pops up. Okay, and that is a word that you see if you read the communist literature, right? If you can get through that boring stuff, it's really tiring to read it, but you'll see the word struggle appears over and over again. Well, how does struggle occur? It occurs through protests on the streets. The more violent, the better, right? It doesn't, improvements don't occur through reasoned debate and representation, of the people, but on the streets and violently. But while Howard Zinn's history is a more traditional Marxist history written with updates, to use 1960s lingo, Hannah Jones takes her cue from Black Power propaganda of the 1960s. But both are essentially Marxist in their outlooks. In her essay, which is titled "The Idea of America" in the New York Times, she describes the United States as indelibly stained by the original sin of slavery and proclaims, and this is a quote, that anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of this country. If it runs in the DNA, you can't get rid of it, right? You're born with it. White America, she says, is afflicted with endemic racism that we still cannot purge from this nation to this day. It's everywhere. It's part of us. She writes, our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written. Black Americans fought to make them true. Without the struggle, America would have no democracy at all. Okay, so it's only through black struggle that we have democracy, according to her. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, according to her, have nothing to do with it. She claims that the United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie, because the white men who drafted the words in the Declaration did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. In contrast, Black Americans believed fervently in the American creed. Through centuries of black resistance and protest, we have helped the country live up to its founding ideals. She writes that Black Americans have been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom. More than any other group in this country's history, we have served generation after generation in an overlooked but vital role. It is we who have been the perfecters of this democracy. Well, she would not agree with George Schuyler in terms of the role that Black Americans have played. As a matter of fact, she on Twitter frequently denounces and insults Black conservatives like Carol Swain. Right? She has no respect for Black Americans who don't have the same idea of how to improve this country other than by violent protest. Okay, so back to Hannah Jones. She says, and she's assuming to be speaking for all Black Americans, she says that Black Americans, more than any other group, embrace the democratic ideals of a common good. Coincidentally, these align with the Democratic Party platform. So these include universal health care, higher minimum wages, open borders, etc. Slaves and their descendants who adhere to these values of the common good are the true founders of our democracy, she says. She also says that the United States would simply not exist without the slaves. Well, that's a debatable point, but let's look at the facts that she lays out. So like Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, she recounts American history, but there are things that are left out, things that are distorted, things that are just simply not true that are there in order to prove her point, which is that America is inherently flawed and inherently racist, and unless we completely overthrow this government, we cannot get rid of this racism, which is exactly what the communists wanted to do. They wanted to promote a revolution under the pretext of advancing equal rights on the basis of race. Okay, what she claims, 400,000 or close to 400,000 Africans were brought here on the slave ships, and their descendants transformed the lands to which they'd been brought, she writes. So she presents them as transforming the lands to which they'd been brought. They cleared the land across the southeast. They taught the colonists to grow rice. They grew and picked cotton that at the height of slavery was the nation's most valuable commodity. They built the plantations of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. They laid the foundations of the White House and the Capitol, even placing with their unfree hands the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol dome. They lugged the heavy wooden tracks of the railroads that crisscrossed the South and that helped take the cotton to pick up. They picked to the northern textile mills, fueling the Industrial Revolution. They built vast fortunes for the white people, north and south. So they did this, and they did this. So let's look at what she's saying. Did they transform the lands and clear them? Yes, of course. But so also did indentured servants. And in the 17th century, when she claims that all this began, slavery was not really codified yet, and the Africans and the white indentured servants worked side by side in the fields. The indentures were usually given their freedom after 7 years, but there is debate about whether or not these Africans were enslaved right when they got here, or were they also indentures? And I'll get to that in a minute. Did they do all the work? Well, when the price of slaves rose in the antebellum period, the Irish and Germans were hired to do the really dangerous work on the railroads and the canals because if they died, it didn't really matter. They wouldn't lose an investment. I mean, that's a sad but true economic fact. Did the slaves grow and pick cotton? Yes, of course. But the value of cotton to the national economy is grossly exaggerated. And one of the essays in the project expands on Hannah Jones's point. And yes, after emancipation, blacks were discriminated against and were abused as sharecroppers, but also a good number of whites were also sharecroppers and picked cotton among other crops. Did the slaves teach the colonists to grow rice? Sometimes. But their knowledge of rice cultivation came from Africa, where there were plantations that were worked by slaves. So that's how they could have learned about rice cultivation. Did they place with their unfree hands the Statue of Freedom atop the Capitol dome? No, the installation took place in late 1863. President Lincoln had signed the Compensated Emancipation Act on April 16, 1862, which abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. One slave, Philip Reed, a skilled foundry worker, is known to have worked on the statue. The final piece of the statue was placed on top of the Capitol dome on December 2, 1863, by which time Philip Reed was a free man. Similarly, Mount Vernon was built by skilled white craftsmen and enslaved apprentices, and the same was true at Monticello. And one of these was John Hemmings, who was freed in Jefferson's will. Hannah Jones describes how the Africans came here claiming that just a few months earlier they had families and farms and lives and dreams. They were free. This was before they were kidnapped by the enslavers. Well, they had been kidnapped, but it was by other African tribes. Right? Frederick Douglass talked about that. All right? So that has been known, and as a result, partly of my research on George Schuyler, I've been reading, Woodson, John Hope Franklin, the black historians who all acknowledge this, but she makes no mention of this. Right? So they were captured. Very rarely would the Europeans come inland to capture the slaves. So unless they allied with some of the more warlike tribes, so they were then sold to African or Muslim middlemen and sold to the white purchasers. And that's something that George Schuyler tried to correct Malcolm X on. And if you see a picture of George Schuyler anywhere, it's usually in his debate with Malcolm X, and Malcolm X did not know that. And of course, he was a Muslim. Okay, so let's see. How much time do I have left? Okay. You're getting close to lunchtime. All right. Okay, so to continue on, I'm just going to go fact after fact, and I go into detail in my book, which will be out September 7th, and I learned quite a bit. I read some pretty gruesome stories about the way the world was in 1776, when slavery existed everywhere except for Western Europe, and but Western Europe, of course, had slaves in their various colonies. Okay, so Hannah Jones claims by 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere, and that the founders believed that independence was required in order to ensure that slavery would continue. If you've kept up with this, you know that I think by now dozens of historians have disputed this. This, of course, is not true. Back in 1921, the black scholar Benjamin Brawley had described the uneven way that slavery had been established in the 13 colonies. It wasn't, as Hannah Jones presents it, the first ship comes over with, we don't know what date, we don't know how many, but they were suddenly slaves. That's not the way it worked. And he also describes the various ways that the colonies had tried to stop the importation of slaves, but were voted down by the mother country. They could not get it past Parliament. Sometimes this was for altruistic reasons. Sometimes, of course, they just didn't, want, more. But they did try in various ways. And her claim that, there was this abolitionist movement going on in Britain is just not true. Another historian, David Breon Davis, says that Britain at the beginning of the 19th century was the leading slave power in the New World. By 1805, he writes, Britannia literally ruled the waves. As a result of its strategic conquests and virtual monopoly of the African slave trade, Britain enjoyed unprecedented control over the labor supply of Caribbean and Latin American slave plantation societies. Okay, Hannah Jones then also claims that Robert Hemmings, the personal servant of, or legally the slave of Thomas Jefferson, would never enjoy the freedoms outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Well, all she had to do was Google his name. He was freed on December 24th, 1794, when he was 32 years old. Okay? That's a fact. She also claims that American slavery was unlike anything that had existed in the world before. That's a quote. That is a quote from her. Unlike anything that had existed in the world before, and that's also the title for one of my chapters. In her warped presentation of history, Hannah Jones ignores the fact that in the 18th century, most of the world's population was not engaged in free labor, but in some form of servitude, right? In the 18th century, people were indentured. The orphans in Ireland and England were rounded up, sent on ships to America. Women were sold as wives to the colonists. It wasn't like the way it is today where you go get a job, you're guaranteed a minimum wage, you have benefits and so forth. But she's wrong, and of course slavery has been going on since time immemorial, right? Okay, slavery was horrible in the United States, of course. But as I learned in my research, it was more horrible in other places. For one thing, slaves were not sacrificed on the altar here. They were by some North American tribes, and they were in Africa, in some tribes on the West Coast, in some of the nations. Sometimes they were sacrificed by live burial with the deceased, who was royalty. So you showed your wealth by how many slaves were sacrificed, or wives, when you died. So I have some of those details too. She also ignores the fact that throughout history, all people have been enslaved at some point. In 18th century, Americans and Europeans were enslaved by the North Africans. These were the Barbary pirates until Thomas Jefferson put a stop to it with the Marines. She ignores the serfs in Russia, their conditions were very, very much like slaves. They weren't freed until 1861. She ignores the peasants in Ireland, who were treated similarly to slaves, but they were facing starvation on top of it. And by the way, as the historian Nell Irvin Painter pointed out in correcting President Trump in his speech at Jamestown in 2019, the Africans who arrived in Jamestown in 1619 may not have been slaves, but may have been indentures. We still don't know for sure. And I went through the historical research, and these historians, there just isn't the documentation. So one says, well, they probably were, but ultimately they don't know. But one of the first Africans over was a man named Anthony Johnson. He came from Angola. He gained his freedom, whether it was as an indentured servant or slave, but he gained his freedom. And after he gained his freedom, he bought his own slaves. A lot of them did. Actually, Frederick Douglass, if Frederick Douglass had played his cards right, after he was abused and his owner, Hugh Auld, proposed, and he was given training in a trade as a caulker, he could have won his freedom at the age of 25 and bought slaves himself, as many did. But Frederick Douglass, was morally repulsed by the idea of slavery, and he talked about freedom. And he has this great speech where he says, the worst thing about slavery is, not necessarily the physical punishment, but the fact that you aren't free. But anyway, so to get back to Anthony Johnson, who's come over from Angola in 1619 or 1621, he has a slave. His name is John Casor. And John Casor, at the end of 7 years, believes that he should get his freedom. That's the way it worked with indentures. Typically, they worked for 7 years, and then they earned their freedom. They worked on these farms, tobacco plantations, mostly in Virginia. Well, Casor goes to two white neighbors. They were brothers, and they help him to sue for freedom. He's saying, hey, my 7 years is up. But the judge ruled in Anthony Johnson's favor in 1654. So Anthony Johnson won the case. And as a historian remarked, who wrote about this, he says that this case of a black man asserting his rights to enslave another black man, it's the earliest record we have of judicial support given to slavery in Virginia. So anyway, but eventually what happened was, the practice of slavery grew, and it became part of law. But the first case, ironically, was with Anthony Johnson. Okay, back to Hannah Jones. She sees Reconstruction as an opportunity for a new order that was missed. Like her idol, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a communist, he felt that during Reconstruction, there should have been a redistribution of property. Okay, and I mentioned that, there were quite a number of free blacks, or a percentage of free blacks, who owned slaves in the South. And they became incredibly wealthy through the ownership of slaves. As a matter of fact, George Schuyler, as he discusses going through the South, he made several trips to the South, and one time he was going to investigate the abuse of black levee workers in Louisiana, and he would stop and visit his friend Dr. Dumas. And Dr. Dumas was a wealthy doctor whose family had acquired their wealth through the ownership of slaves. Class distinctions remained. I think there is this effort to sort of put all black Americans as poor and oppressed and as descendants of slaves. And this is one thing that George Schuyler pointed out. There was a wide variety. There were the upper classes, the lower classes. He talks about, his mother, who was a Yankee in Syracuse, New York, not wanting to associate with migrants. There were wealthy blacks in New York and Philadelphia in the 1890s, turn of the century. Some of them employed white immigrant women as their servants. Okay, they acquired wealth through, the traditional means. Okay, the two main targets, the historical targets of Hannah Jones's essay, are Thomas Jefferson, formerly known as the, quote, apostle of freedom, and Abraham Lincoln, usually known as the great emancipator. Jefferson is presented in a cartoonish way as someone who runs a slave labor camp. She uses that term inappropriately, trying to conjure up images of Nazism, right? Jefferson, if you go through his papers and his letters and you read his biography, yes, he was a slave owner. He did not like it. He was born into slavery, or born into a slave-holding family. His first recorded memory is of being carried on horseback from one estate to another by a slave. Well, Hannah Jones says that slaves, black people, were treated as subhuman. But I would ask, would you trust your 2-year-old son to be carried on horseback by someone who is subhuman, right? That's not true. He tried in various ways to end slavery. He is responsible for the outlawing of the international slave trade in 1808. He saw that as one of his greatest accomplishments. I go into how his younger friend tried to free his slaves in Illinois, the problems he had. Jefferson came up with concepts like diffusionism. He felt that if slavery were sort of spread out, that it would die out. He wanted to end slavery peacefully. Abraham Lincoln is treated in a similar manner. She chooses one incident in 1862 where Lincoln proposes colonization to 5 black men. She presents it that he just wants to get rid of them and he wants to send them someplace else. Well, it's a little more complicated. I guess the whole point is that history is complicated. The propaganda that you get is simplified, right? Colonization was proposed by the Quakers in the early 18th century already. They felt, maybe out of ignorance, but they felt that if blacks they would go to their native land and be free. Some slave owners freed their slaves and sent them to Liberia, which was started in land was bought under the Monroe administration. And because there were all these stipulations on them, there had to be bonds, they had to prove that they were self-supporting and so forth. She ignores the Lincoln-Douglas debates. She ignores all the events leading up to the Civil War. She ignores the fact that there were white abolitionists. She doesn't acknowledge that any white people worked for abolition or for civil rights. William Lloyd Garrison, who was white, grew up poor and fatherless, was supported by funds donated by well-off blacks. Frederick Douglass received support from white supporters, got his freedom that way. Finally, Matthew Desmond, in another essay, makes the economic case that all the wealth and power of this country is built on slaves growing cotton. Well, there are 3 economic historians that refute this new school of capitalism. It's a Marxist school. First of all, they can't do arithmetic. They overestimate how much of the GDP cotton was. They claim it was 50%. It was only 5%. They ignore the fact that slavery did not really build the wealth of this nation. Actually, it kept the South backwards. It disincentivized infrastructure because slaves could be moved, so you didn't have the railroad building and the road building. It kept wages artificially low, so there was vast poverty among whites and blacks, and there were the enslaved, and a tiny percentage of the plantation owners who were wealthy. And she also ignores the fact that it was not only the white plantation owners who got wealthy. She ignores the black plantation owners, but she also ignores the people in Africa who became incredibly wealthy through selling slaves. And there was this long article by a Nigerian woman whose family had been slave traders and become wealthy. It was published in the Wall Street Journal. Anybody hear of it? Read it. Okay, it's in my book. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating story. But there's no thought given to reparations from them, right? So finally, I've got a couple points. One of the economic historians that I quote is Gavin Wright. And remember that the ideas in the 1619 Project are not really new. So the economic argument that slaves made the wealth of this country is adopted from this new neo-Marxist school called the New History of Capitalism. It's an anti-capitalist theory. But there is a parallel to what is claimed in the 1619 Project, which comes from this new history, to what Karl Marx wrote. Karl Marx wrote, "Without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. To do away with slavery would be to wipe America off the map." That didn't happen, did it, right? America has not been wiped off the map. And remember the similar phrase from Hannah Jones. She said the United States would simply not exist without the slaves. And keep in mind Karl Marx's quotation. She also stated that Wall Street would not be a thriving banking, insurance, and trading sector, and New York City would not become the financial capital of the world without the relentless buying, selling, insuring, and financing of slaves' bodies and the products of their labor. So the takeaway from the 1619 Project is that the only way America can be redeemed of what is falsely called her original sin is to follow the Marxist path of the 1619 Project. So I meant to put this up. This is Nicole Hannah-Jones. She is the creator. And you may have heard that she was offered a 5-year position as an endowed chair at UNC North Carolina, but wasn't given tenure. Now she's going to go to Howard University. She's making incredible amounts of money, $25,000 per speech. Most of these have been done remotely. Yeah, no, I mean, she's a millionaire many times over now with this. And yeah, and she's repressed. I'll tell you one thing. She was offered $180,000 a year at UNC, plus her salary at the New York Times, plus $25,000 a speech, which she was doing once every 2 weeks, approximately. Okay? I was making $18,000 the last year when I was teaching 2 classes a semester at Emory University, but I have white privilege, I guess.